Today, I'm delighted to welcome Anish Lalchandani, Global Head of Talent Management at Maersk and author of The Skills Advantage to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Anish, welcome to the show. To kick things off, could you give listeners a short introduction to you and your journey that brought you to where you are today?
Sure, David. First of all, thanks, David, for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Uh, if I look at my career, means last two and a half decades, I've had the privilege of working with some amazing organizations like AB Moller Maersk, Standard Chartered, GE, Jones Lang LaSalle, and many others. But not only they are very, very dynamic, but the way they look at value and purpose has been kind of something a very big learning for me, and that's how it has hugely influence on how I approach my work as well. So the first phase of my career started in business, looking at consumer finance, looking at business operations, learning how do we look at processes and all of that. And what I realized was, in a couple of years' time, that it's great to have some of these processes and operations, but things either succeed or fail purely depending on how people come together. And that curiosity led me to kind of read quite a lot around organizational behavior, go and do studies in HR. And that led me to the second phase of my career within HR. My first HR stint was really looking at M&A kind of projects. And from that, it led me to do a number of transformation projects and programs around people, process, technology, OD, looking at how do we kind of set up learning academies or digital learning. And it was also quite widespread. It was looking at some aspects in China to India to Dubai to Europe. So quite diverse people to work with, and also a lot of HR disciplines to kind of look at in that space. And from there, I realized I think I need to specialize a bit. And that's where I think my last decade of my work has been around talent, leadership, and culture. Now, again, in that, it's quite a broad area. So for me, initially, I spent quite a lot of my kind of time on executive succession, looking at management team succession planning and development. We started to kind of then look at the next generation of leader pools, diverse talent pools, and how do we overall look at talent from a workforce point of view as well. So quite a lot of interesting work in that space. And at Maersk, I do the same. Yeah. So I'm looking at global talent management. We are looking at how do we reimagine talent and performance. And for people who don't know about Maersk, means Maersk is a 100,000 odd employee, 130 countries, 100 odd kind of nationalities. So quite massive and complex. And our work is essentially around ocean logistics and supply chain. So things like Red Sea always kind of bother us, and that kind of helps us to think of, okay, how do we do things differently? How do we make sure we are always ready for what the business is looking for? So bringing all of these experiences together, from a practice leadership to also reading and writing around skills, that led me to write this book. But funny enough, if you would asked me this question when I was younger, I would have told you I want to join an army. I don't know what I would have been thinking of, maybe just the cool uniform. But as things have evolved, I found my space, and I really love what I do now.
That's great. So that's a great introduction, Anish. It's lovely to hear how your sort of careers helped you land where you are. And I think it's funny, isn't it? I was smiling when you said that, when you were younger, you thought you wanted to be in the army. I was thinking back to what I wanted to do as a small boy, and that was to be an international cricket player, which although I'm reasonably good at cricket, no way near good enough to even contemplate playing for England or anyone else for that matter. I'm really looking forward to our conversation as well, Anish. Not least because, as you disproved there, you've published the Skills Advantage this year. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about skills for a while now. A lot of the stuff that's getting published is coming from consultants, it's coming from vendors, and that's absolutely fine. They contribute a lot to the conversation. I think what's great about your book is it's actually coming from a practitioner who's applying some of these techniques within their organization as well. So in some respects, that kind of tells me that skills is really a thing and companies are really doing it. So I think that's really good. So as I said, in your book, and I'll give the full title here for listeners, The Skills Advantage, a human-centered, sustainable and scalable approach to reskilling. You write in detail on the importance of reskilling the workforce. Now, we hear a lot about upskilling, but I really enjoyed your focus on reskilling. Maybe you could explain to listeners what the difference between upskilling and reskilling is and why you think reskilling should take priority.
So David, when I started writing this book, yeah, it was all around the way the business models are being disrupted, how people are looking at the entire like business cycle. If we look at the S&P companies, the tenure of S&P companies used to be say 30, 35 years in 1970s, and that's reduced to 15 years now. And we're talking about big, massive S&P companies, if you ask me, S&P listed companies. And that led me to start kind of thinking, how will this really play out for us, for any organization? We've been always focusing on upskilling people into their current jobs so that they can perform better. But that would essentially warrant that we start to look at new jobs, new job families, and that requires reskilling. And that requires a bit different approach than purely upskilling. And that is where I see the biggest transformation happening. It's not about how we're going to take all our colleagues on this journey, but how do we reskill them so that they're ready for the new jobs which are coming. Even if we look at the World Economic Forum studies, or research, it talks about 89 million jobs disappearing by next year, 90 million new jobs appearing. That raises a big question. What does that mean then? Yeah. And then if we add the third aspect, which is what I call in my book is around talent uprising, people are looking for meaningful jobs. They're looking for meaningful careers. They're looking for how does it connect to their purpose. They're not passively going to accept anything which is going to come their way. That would mean a huge change management effort, which is human centered, as well as we can sustain it. And that led me to kind of really think, okay, if we're really looking at this, we need to do things differently than what's there today. And reskilling is where you start to essentially look at all of these aspects, but then bring them back in this entire journey. I kind of take the analogy of it's like a roller coaster. Something is going up, something is going down, and it is like spinning. It's quite messy and disruptive, not only on the business side, but also people. And that's been my attempt to say is like, how do we connect these dots from business point of view, from people point of view, from HR point of view, and kind of look at this bit differently. So that was the main purpose for me to kind of, zoom in around reskilling and how we kind of, do things a bit differently and how we bring that out across HR.
And as you said, it's that nexus, isn't it, where HR people and the business come together, and you need all three elements because you need to obviously invest your reskilling efforts in areas where the business is going to need and the business is going to grow, where there's gaps today, as you said, that will give people purposeful careers and able to contribute as well. And obviously, you need to do that within a lens of your own organisation as well, with HR effectively orchestrating, I guess, a lot of this work. In the skills advantage, you break down the reskilling strategy into four cornerstones of reskilling: awareness, application, agility, and alliances. Could you walk us through each of these, walk listeners through each of these and how they kind of work together in practice?
Sure. So it's like a recipe, if you ask me. Yeah. So in the recipe, you have ingredients, and these are the cornerstones in a way are the ingredients to that recipe. And there's definitely a kind of a step-by-step process of how do you build that strategy from planning, identifying, developing, deploying, and measuring. Yeah. But if I look at these cornerstones, and the reason I chose to write it this way, because I feel every organization has a bit different context, the way they operate. There's going to be no playbook which is going to be very, very standard and everyone can just pick it up and apply. So it has to be business context and how they look at some of these cornerstones and what it makes sense for them. Yeah, that's how if you ask me, it all comes together. So when I talk about the first one, which is essentially around awareness, it's all about, are we really, really very clear, why we are doing all of these programs? What does it mean for the individual? lot many times actually, we are chasing people to do their post scores, get them into programs, track their attendance, because we don't get that engagement. And that's a tricky part because we haven't solved the why in that matter. Yeah, so we're always looking for, okay, what do we do, what programs, content we bring in, but we haven't solved that why. We haven't solved what's in it for me, for the individual. Yeah, so that's where I think it's important for us to bring all of our colleagues in this journey to be self-aware, but also to be aware about what's happening to the jobs outside, what's the future of work, where the industry is growing. And if we do that in a manner which, like Unilever and a number of firms have done, it'll be far easier for us to manage that change management effort. So that's the first one. The second one is essentially around doubling down on application of skills. So, can I learn driving by watching a YouTube video? Possibly not. Yeah, and that's the bit we need to be thoughtful about. Courses can help us to build knowledge, but may not be the skills. And that is the reason I also call out learning in the flow of work. For reskilling, it has to be thought a bit differently, because you're actually preparing people for jobs which they're not doing and they're not even there in today. So how do you take a bit different approach, but really zoom into how do we look at application of skills and bring, of course, there's technology to do it, to scale it, but how can we then keep that human centered element also connected with that, what people really like. Then the third one is around agility, the golden thread, I call it, of agility, because what I find is, as I said, there's no standard playbook. The business needs will keep evolving and pivoting. At times, we're actually catching up in terms of what we are doing for the business. So, how can we be proactive? How can we use data, insights, and foresights to really understand why we're doing this? How do we design some of this work? And if it needs to change, we have all the kind of building blocks like a Lego to move around it very fast. So how do we build that agility into the way we do things? Through data and also through technology, because there are a number of tech solutions which are there which can help us to amplify this quite a lot and help us in this journey to make it easier and scale it as well. So there's strategies around how can we do this better, how some organizations are doing it, and it will help us overall to have that effectiveness in terms of reskilling. And the last one is the most interesting, I think. It's around alliances. Means there's always a question: who's responsible for reskilling? For me, I think it's about how can different players and partners come together. There's definitely a role of leader, individual, but many other organizations, government, and a number of other players who come into this. So how can we bring and look at this as an ecosystem change and bring all of them together so that we can actually, progress on this and be agile enough so that we're able to address the business needs. So these are the four cornerstones, and as I said, it's a matter of how do you pick and choose, but they're all connected as you see in that manner.
No, it's really interesting. Thanks for breaking them down, and we're certainly going to dig into some of those a bit later in our conversation, particularly alliances. I'm really interested in talking about that, particularly given your experience of being in Singapore, I think, where there is a closer alliance, I would say, between business and government than there maybe is in other countries, certainly the one I happen to be sitting in at the moment in the United Kingdom. So again, one of the things, and again, one of the endorsements on the book, actually, I was looking at this just before we had our conversation. Really good one from Andrew Spence, who I know well, Andy. As a global, and his quote is, "As a global talent leader, Anish is perfectly positioned to guide leaders on how to develop a successful reskilling strategy." And it just sort of echoes what I was kind of saying a bit earlier, that it's great that a practitioner is actually writing a book about skills and about reskilling. So what I'm wondering now, you can guess what's coming next, Anish, as in your current role, or maybe in previous roles, but in your current role as the global head of talent management at AP Moller Maersk, how are you applying this framework, these 4 A's, towards your reskilling initiatives at Maersk?
First of all, I think thank you again, David, to mention that. So you're right. I think we are all doing some of these, and maybe I can talk about Maersk specifically. So we are taking a very, very focused and thoughtful approach in terms of how do we do this. the first thing for us is super clear, is it's all about how we're connecting the business strategy. What is a problem statement and why do we need to do this? Because we don't want this to come as a HR practice or a solution, and we're trying to really chase people to do this. So we are definitely, I think that's the first piece for us to say is all the work we're doing, we align it to our business strategy, and we have a very ruthless way of prioritizing things, and we really have to write, say, a press release before even we start some of the work, so that what will be the impact of this would be. Yeah, so we kind of started that journey, I would say. Number of examples I can share. One is in some specific areas, we are actually looking at what is the business priorities below the business strategy. What are the business capabilities do we need? And then kind of start looking at translating that into sort of skill demand and supply view as well. It becomes a big strategic workforce planning discussion, but at the same time, a big talent discussion as well. Yeah, so we're trying to connect some of that and doing that in very, very focused areas, if you ask me. And we just started that journey. So that's one. In a number of other areas, we are looking at what are some of the pivotal skills we need, or the job families where we need to really build that pipeline. So we have possibly invested now in buying, but how do we build that pipeline for some of the specific roles? And we are doing a major work around upskilling and reskilling those, specifically those job families. The third bit, which we are doing it in different ways, is less about a project or an intervention, but more about how do we really create a culture of continuous learning, growth, and agility. A couple of weeks ago, I ran a session, and the session was titled as Rethinking Career Progression. It was not publicized too much within Maersk, but a specific ERG group, and all of a sudden we saw like 800 people signing up for that. Yeah, and most of them kind of turned up, and we saw, wow. When we got people in that discussion, we talked about personal development. We talked about essentially creating that awareness of what do you want to do, what are you seeing. And we also saw a huge gap in terms of what people don't know about what Maersk offers in terms of employee development and all the entire proposition. So that was an interesting moment for us to think is how do we start to do some of these smaller things, but in an agile manner, so that we start to build that culture. We start to create that awareness and application aspect so that we can continue on this journey as well. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of such things we're doing. But as I said, I would definitely think we just got started. We also get a lot of feedback in terms of what we've done so that we can iterate the process and take to the next level. But yeah, there is definitely a big kind of focus for us in terms of how do we focus on upskilling and reskilling, building careers, and a number of those areas.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And again, having spoken to a number of your peers in other organisations who are, reasonably far forward on the whole skills discussion, it does seem that skills is almost acting like a silver thread. And this is something that Anish Lalchandani told me in an episode when he was at IBM, a silver thread that links what have been traditional silos in the talent life cycle together. So whether that's recruiting and onboarding, whether particularly learning, I think career mobility, and workforce planning, because this is where I think skills can be a win-win for the organization because it supports the workforce planning and the achievement of the business strategy, but is also a win for employees because it helps them develop their careers within the organization, acquire new skills, get fulfill their purpose, but also probably get to where they want to get from a kind of compensation perspective and a kind of promotion perspective as well. And I think that's really interesting. I think the key thing that you said there, though, right at the start, was that you connect this work with your business strategy, because it's not to be underestimated the amount of work that would probably need to be involved in really doing skills, that's particularly across the talent life cycle. I don't know if you could talk a little bit to maybe some of your peers who might be listening. What are some of the tips that you would give to them to make sure that, as you said, it's not an HR initiative, but they're really connecting this work to business strategy?
Sure. So as I said, if we do this as a HR thing, we're chasing it all the time. And the work we did with one of the specific kind of products within Maersk was, it's relatively a new product, if you ask me. It's a business product I'm kind of referring to here. They have built that team very recently. Yeah. So we know we've kind of gone and bought those skills today. But there's also a big piece that we need to round really take it to the next level. And there are specific targets from a business point of view. And when you pull that discussion to say is what are the capabilities we need and what we have, that's people then say we don't know that, and that's true. But then they know this is a problem statement from a business point of view need to be solved. And I use this analogy of Legos, if you ask me, as you rightly said, means they're all over. So I see skills as that Lego set, and you have multiple Lego parts, and you can bring them together, you can tweak them, you can create the shape you want from that point of view. And that was for us more about focusing on that change management piece upfront. Yeah, so it's less about how do we do it, what skills taxonomy to look at. All of that, in my view, kind of comes later. But we helped the business to understand what the gaps are. Yeah, and I think we ran a couple of kind of workshops in this to say what does this mean for us. And there are also a lot of things which they are the experts, if you ask me, in this space. Yeah, but then how do we scale it was a big question. How do we take it to the next granular level was a big question. And I said, fine, as HR, we can bring some of that expertise or tools to kind of start looking at that. So that was, if you ask me, the biggest. The second, I know it becomes like overwhelming when you start thinking of this as doing it for the entire organization. If it's 100,000 employees, it just starts feel like overwhelming. We have to be very, very focused. We have to really look at starting small, looking at it where we need it, and use it in different ways. Yeah, so it's not always about the same thing we'll have to apply across. So I think we have to kind of really be agile enough to kind of look at it and pivot in different ways for different business organizations. It is going to be challenging. I wouldn't say that it's easy, as it sounds. It is going to be challenging because you're looking at it very, very different aspects. But as that comes together, that helps you to start building success stories, start to kind of look at next level, start to look at the next layer. So it means these are some of the tips I would say. But of course, this is an area which is constantly evolving. And we start to look at, say, one platform, and all of a sudden, 3 months down the line, things change drastically. So I think that's another piece, in my view, to say is constantly be in the know-how or build that awareness of what's going on, because that can also influence the strategy on how we do some of these things.
No, very good. And as you said, it's evolving, and this is where practitioners talking to each other can be really, really helpful. I mean, one of the things we do it with our people analytics program at Insight 222, we bring practitioners together on a regular basis, and you won't be surprised to hear that skills data and using it effectively is one of the topics that comes up quite frequently. And interestingly, actually, building a little bit on what you've said, some of the recent research that we've done at Insight 222 on the people analytics ecosystem, and I think this applies here as well, is that building external and internal partnerships is essential to being successful. So I wonder really, what are some of the collaborations that you value in Immersion that you've seen that really made a difference in reskilling?
I totally agree with you, David. Because the partnerships, the way we're looking at either internal or external, they're going to really help us, progress on this journey. Let's look at what does it mean from a skills point of view and internal. And this is where also I talk in my book quite a lot about which team is going to do it. And I've use the very loose term HR team. And I explained it why, because it's very, very clear we have to get analytics, talent acquisition, talent management, L&D, HR business partners, even ER to a certain extent, all of them involved in this. And that needs to be, again, I would say, done in a way where we partner on different phases of some of this work. How do we essentially then also start looking at bringing them together and build on each other's expertise in that manner, which is where I think, like agile teams to solve some of these big problems have to come together. And that's where I've seen, I think, working for us as well, to say is we bring in a number of, we call them people solutions and other teams together to kind of start kind of looking at this internally. Because if we don't do this, and this is also have seen in other organizations, is we would have a very silo approach. We would possibly put solutions out where the narrative is not going to connect for leaders and colleagues. And that integration, in my view, is very, very important. And in the context of skills, definitely, because as you said, it touches across the entire life cycle. Yeah. So I call it like a skills life cycle rather than employee life cycle now. So it has to be that. When we look at external, I also think there's a lot of innovation going on in the market. there's a lot of insights and research which is there, and we need to use it to our advantage. We need to be very clear as, again, business context, business problem, and where do we strategically look at different partners who can come in, help us in some of this, or we can even kind of use some of the research to influence people. So that different ways, essentially, we can kind of start to look at building those partnerships. And of course, we've worked with some of the partners as well to say, how do we do this? How do we do that? Or even like, as you said, like Insight 2.2, how do we go into some of those conferences or, specific events where people can come together and share this? Because there's no secrets in this, but there's, of course, definitely a lot of insights and learnings which can be shared. As long as I think it helps us to be on this journey and be connected to the business, I think the partnerships are going to really be helpful.
No, very good. And then measuring success, we talked about connecting what we're doing to business strategy. How do we go about measuring success? What are the key metrics, if it is metrics, that HR leaders should focus on, and how can they know if their reskilling efforts are really making a difference?
That's again a good one, yeah, because at times we say let's do a pilot or a small thing and we'll see. Yeah, I think the agility is needed, but I would definitely think as we start any of this work, we need to be very, very clear on the problem statement. I use like three lenses of what's the business imperative of doing this. Like, are we expanding? Are we shrinking? Are we increasing the number of product what we kind of offer? Are we changing the service model? What is that business need? If you ask me. Then the second one is also around people. What are people looking for? What are we hearing from listening sessions, engagement surveys? What is there? The third one, which kind of I like and not like, is the financial imperative. Because yes, I think a lot of people look at it, okay, so what's going to be the cost benefit of this? What's the ROI of this? So again, I kind of give options for people to say how they can update and evaluate the ROI. But we need to move in terms of measuring beyond the ROI, in my view. We need to start looking at what's the value this is going to create for the business, how we measure that. And it can be in different ways. It can be around innovation, how are we using skills intelligence, skills data, bringing teams together, having that right ambition and purpose to innovate something or to manage a risk or to solve a business problem. Yeah. And how do we really start to bring that value lens and value chain to our business leaders when it comes to measuring, but also for us? Because if we kind of just start looking at measuring adoption, which is great, like how many people attended, number of clicks, number of sessions, that's all great, but that's not going to tell us the impact. It's going to tell us the effort of what we're doing. So we need to be very thoughtful in balancing this, because this can itself become a very complex area to measure. But we need to start thinking of ways of, okay, am I increasing my skills pool for the high demand skills? Am I looking at proficiency level of skills kind of changing? Are we looking at saving costs because we redeployed a number of people and didn't do redundancies? So for me, I think when you specifically lean into the reskilling piece, the measure of success is a bit different than upskilling. Yeah. And that all kind of boils down to connecting it to the business problem, but being very, very thoughtful, that we let two or three big super measures we kind of go after. And there are others which are like, we start to kind of collect the data. And again, technology is going to help us in many ways, because when you start planning and designing, that's where you start seeing, we get all of this interesting data. And how do we then use that to use the iterative cycle of improving? Because as I said, you can start an experiment, but you'll have to have actually a lot of measures to see if it's working or not working. And that's a kind of a cycle we kind of use. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways to do this, but I always think it's also like, you have to be very, very focused on this.
Yeah, and we'll definitely come to the technology piece in a minute. And I think interesting listening to what you were saying there, I guess tactically, depending on the organization that you're in, if you have to show a saving to maybe get more buy-in from senior leaders, or more momentum and more investment, perhaps. I think you touched on one area there, which I've seen organizations do. It's that, by reskilling and redeploying people, you save, money on recruitment. And you can quantify the money that you're saving in recruitment as well. And sometimes I've seen your peers and other organizations use that almost as a way of getting more investment and more buy-in, and maybe broadening out what may have been in a pilot to start off with. I guess it's just understanding your stakeholders and understanding what lever you need to pull and when, I guess, as well. But as you said, but trying, yes, and I appreciate you need to be tactical sometimes, but trying to be a bit more strategic about how you want to measure the value moving forward. So I think there's some good advice in there, Anish. I don't know if you want to talk to that at all, of whether sometimes you've had to do, a tactical. You've seen when you were doing the research on the book, organisations maybe making a tactical move to show some savings to generate momentum.
So yeah, I think there are different ways people have approached this. Yeah. So yes, I think as I said, a lot of people like the ROI concept. And I think yes, I think it's there's a way of how do we measure it and how do we position it, and that's the piece around if you connect all these dots together around how we're hiring, how we are developing, how we are redeploying people, that comes kind of naturally to people. If you do it in that one team, that actually becomes very, very difficult then, because then you are actually looking at a very smaller problem and a smaller saving. Yeah. But then to flip that to say, if you're doing this, can we really look at the 5-year kind of overall forecast of how this would be helpful. So you're right. I think, it's different ways of understanding your stakeholders. Means CFOs would love this discussion. They want that. Yeah. On the other side, there'll be other kind of leaders who would think, okay, no, I think as a culture, as a practice, we are invested in this, and this is how we do it, and we're fine. Let's look at the other value proposition. So yeah, it is a tricky one, I would say, because they're different, diverse stakeholders, and it's always like you have to kind of pivot and think, okay, how do we position this so that it's like really meaningful for people, but as well as I think it helps you to get the investment, buy it, and go further.
Yeah, very good. We could probably have a whole episode on that particular question alone. But you mentioned technology, and AI is clearly one of the catalysts that's driving the urgency around reskilling, and given how work and organizations are transforming faster, partly because of technology. But technology can also supercharge and actually almost act as the bullet train that helps us reach our reskilling goals by actually powering some of the technology that does the reskilling as well. But then there's always that conversation that we have around the potential detrimental effect that over-reliance on AI and technology can have on our cognitive abilities. I'd be interested to hear from you, as someone that's in the actually doing this work at the moment as global head of talent management. How do we strike the balance?
Oh, that's a tough question. I would say. But let's look at multiple maybe perspectives around this topic. The first aspect, what you highlighted, is true. Means using technology can help us scale, help us amplify, help us reskill people faster, for sure. If you ask me, yeah. When we look at it from an architecture and ecosystem point of view, yeah. But then when we look at the impact of AI on skills, and this is what I wrote in one of my recent newsletters, it becomes very, very interesting. Yeah. And let me take a couple of examples. Like means all of us, use GPS when we drive. Uh, and it's not even AI, it's just a technology. But actually, research has pointed out that when you start using GPS, your abilities, around the sense of direction, they call it spatial skills, actually has deteriorated because GPS has been there for a while. Yeah. The other AI and chat GPT is new. So we don't have any research on that. But there's also very clear research around, if you're not using your skills, you're not applying those skills, they will deteriorate. There's a concept called as skills atrophy, that they will deteriorate, and people have done like empirical research on this topic in different ways to look at that. Now we don't know exactly how it's going to be for ChatGPT, but I think it will be, because that's been even more, it's more in our lives and work, if you ask me, compared to any other technology. So this is a very interesting discussion which has started, if you ask me, because purely we think, okay, ChatGPT and all of these models are coming into the play. One of the things we need to be thoughtful about is where are we using AI and technology and where are we not? Yeah. So if it's low value, repetitive task, we know those skills. In my view, actually, it's okay. It helps you to be more productive. But when you are, like, say, coming into a new job, starting a new job, really looking at building your skills and capabilities, then those shortcuts are not going to help us, in my view. Yeah. And the third aspect also is, how do you have that balance and integration of using technology, using tools, but also being independent in some way? So this is, in my view, a fascinating topic, to kind of explore further and further. But what I definitely think is all organizations need to start a discussion on this, because we have all these interesting AI laws coming in. But how are we looking at that adoption within an organization? And the big question for organizations is, what kind of workforce do we need in the future? Do we need people who can use, all the AI technology and just solve everything, but very productive? But when things change, will they be able to adapt to different circumstances and really use the human skills which are really required, which makes us different, and be successful? So that's, I think, a big discussion and dilemma, if you ask me, in many ways, for many people. I'm still researching and looking at how this will span out in the future, but it's a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I suppose what, even if you get it down to simple as looking at sunset skills and sunrise skills, what we think are sunrise skills at the moment, given how fast the technology is moving, may not be sunrise skills in 12, 18 months' time. So I guess we just need to continually be looking at the empirical research, as you said. We need to be doing experimentation ourselves as much as we can within our organizations. And we just need to read a lot, I guess, in HR, just to see where things are going, and then you've got as you said, the complexity of AI regulation coming in as well. So and it's different in different jurisdictions as well. So it's very complex if you're working in a global role like you are in a global organization. So yeah, very 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 interesting to watch. Exciting, but challenging, I think. Now let's look. So we looked at the technology. We've looked at it at an organisational perspective as well. Now I'm going to dive into that little bit that you talked about around alliances. I think so. When we talk about reskilling, and in many organisations, a lot of emphasis is placed on the organisation itself and individuals within the organisation to take ownership of their own careers and their own learning and reskilling. You know, clearly organizations can provide the tools, but equally individuals should be proactive in obtaining new skills, but as long as they're given the climate and the means to do it. But I think, as you've talked about, and I think when the initial conversation we had around alliances, this goes beyond an organizational challenge. So I'd love to hear, your thoughts around governments and educational institutions being able to do more. And I think you've got some specific experience of that, of course, in Singapore, and there's other countries as well that are far more proactive, I guess. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So me, I think, it's always a big debate topic, who's responsible for reskilling. I think we need to convert this debate into a dialogue. And the dialogue needs to be with education institutes, government bodies, organizations, industry bodies. And as you rightly said, means there's a clear role and need for leaders, mentors, and coaches, and also the agency of the individual. So all of that's there. And that was my kind of, also curiosity when I was researching about this, to say is, we need to think about this more holistically. So if you're getting graduates in an organization and they're not really, have the skills, then we need to reskill them at that stage. So what happens before? Who's responsible for it? So I actually spoke to the Finland Education and Innovation Department, and they're kind of, one of the best in the schooling system. And I was fascinated in terms of how they are looking at future of education. As we talk about future of work, they are looking at future of education. And they are also grappling with a number of these topics. But they've also made some really good headways in terms of how they can approach this. If the number of things they're doing, one was, I think, very interesting for me to think is how to learn. It's not, they're not only looking at how to learn, they're also looking at, okay, I'm going to say this again. So they're looking essentially at how to learn, not just what to learn. Yeah. They're also looking at how do we bring in multidisciplinary approach in terms of problem solving. So not only teaching you science or arts, they're actually looking at how does science and art come together. And when you start picking that up and looking at, okay, how do I solve a climate change kind of a problem, that becomes very, very experiential, applying the skills, and also kind of helpful. So they're building, the next generation based on that basis. Not only the knowledge, but also the agility for them so that they can actually solve bigger problems. They can actually adapt to different circumstances. They can also then learn a new skill or a new technology which comes in very fast. So that was very, very interesting for me. And I think, as you rightly said, that also the role of governments. So Singapore, there's a huge, I call it movement of skills future, where government is bringing in industry bodies and organizations together. They're also building their own entire ecosystem around skills, job descriptions, job redesign, and helping. And I think that help is quite a lot more focused also on SMEs. Because think of it, big organizations would set up their own things. But for SMEs, actually, it's very, very difficult for them. They are constrained by resources and knowledge. So as a nation, they are looking at how do we build skills for all the people who are there in Singapore. And that's another unique approach I've seen in Singapore. The other countries were doing different parts of it in Denmark, in India, in France as well. But if we start to, as I said, look at the ecosystem, we need to start then looking at what are the best ways we can actually tap onto that. How do we not really go and reinvent the wheel in different areas, but how do we talk to all these partners, bring them together, and use that? And I think even in the UK, I'm sure the number of like even financial subsidies that people get, yeah, or organizations get. So how do you use the not only the financial aspect, but the research aspect, but the ecosystem aspect, and bring that together? And if we do that, I think it's going to help us to accelerate this journey of reskilling.
You're right. Things are changing so fast. Industry can't be going, in a different direction from education and government. Ultimately, education is so important because it's our workers of the future that are being produced, and it's got to be connected to what business needs and what the data tells us that we're going to need as well in the future. So it kind of makes sense. It sounds easy. It's obviously very, very difficult to put all that to. So now, Anish, we're coming towards the end of our conversation. So this is the penultimate question. This is the question of the series that we're asking all the guests on this series of the podcast. How can organizations leverage skills intelligence to make more informed decisions?
So skills are the new currency of work. Yeah. So if we look at how do we understand the skills what we have, like identify what we have, the sunrise skills, emerging declining skills, then that's going to give us a lot of fuel to say, okay, so this is our further strategies of how would I develop those skills, the specific ones. As I was talking about this example around, different kind of job families, actually that gave us an insight as okay, this is where we need to start now focusing for developing. And as you start to kind of then look at using that insight for development, then you're okay, ready with this is how I'm going to deploy those skills. This is where I see the big demand coming. This is where I see adjacent skills. This is where I would really like to, like people would like to go there, if you ask me, from a human-centered approach. So if we're able to really understand the demand and supply view of skills and use this lens around identify, develop, and deploy, that's going to help us to make number of decisions on investments, on business aspect in terms of where do we kind of go next, as well as kind of tell us that what are the gaps we have. So if there are big pockets where we realize that okay, either people are not getting opportunities or we see these skills very different in a particular geography, then that's going to give us a lot of input to say how do we address this. So it becomes a huge kind of decision making tool, if you ask me. And as we also talked about, it touches all aspects of HR process or life cycle. So it's not only like, as I said, just development is one of the core things I highlighted, but it can also be how do we attract people on that? How do we start kind of looking at kind of internal mobility on that basis? So yes, it is very, very important for us to use this data in a way so that it's integrated across the HR life cycle and kind of put that into decision making.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other things that skills intelligence can help you do is give you some insight into maybe new skills that your competitors might be hiring as well. So it can kind of give you that competitor intelligence as well, which I guess which can also be helpful.
That's true. That's where I think the awareness around what's going outside starts to happen. That's where you also start to realize what are the trends and what's changing. And on that kind of overall kind of understanding, you can start to put and plan your strategies ahead.
Well, Anish, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I really enjoyed your book, The Skills Advantage, as well. And I definitely recommend listeners dig into that. Before we part, can you let listeners know how they can find out more about you on social media? You mentioned that you publish a newsletter regularly as well. Find out more about the book and all the other work, the great work that you're doing as well, Anish.
So first of all, David, thank you for inviting me for this conversation. Really enjoyed it. And again, thank you also for you. Means you've been doing amazing work for the HR community, and I read your newsletter, which has been very insightful as well.
Thank you.
For me, it's very easy. It's LinkedIn. So I think I would love a conversation around this topic or any questions people have. A lot of the book related resources or the newsletter is on my website, which is www.anishlalchandani.com. So they can find me there.
Great. Well, thanks for the kind words as well, Anish. That's very generous of you. And thank you as well, for being a practitioner that's sharing your experiences and your expertise and your knowledge with the wider community. It's really helpful. It helps us thrive as a community and hopefully get better at what we do and ultimately help our employees get more purpose from work, which ultimately that's got to be what it's all about. So, Anish, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks, David.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.